Hello, so now we're going to talk about how we develop effective behavior intervention plans when we have a good functional assessment or functional analysis completed. So a good behavior plan starts with data from the functional assessment techniques that we've talked about. Teacher interviewer rating scales, parent interviewer rating scales, direct observation, descriptive assessment ABC data, and functional analysis. We would avoid writing a behavior plan because we don't have sufficient information to build our confidence in our findings if we have just it based on interviews or rating scales alone, based on anecdotal information, or general impressions. We've got to have that direct observation descriptive assessment piece. A behavior intervention plan should include a brief demographic summary of the student, target behavior and the operational definition, the function of the behavior, and the assessment procedures that you used to identify that function. Antecedent-based strategies, consequence-based strategies, information on how data are going to be collected, terminal goals for the intervention, and procedures for fading the intervention. Behavior intervention plans must be function-based. They should be behaviorally sound. They should fit the setting. There's no point in developing the quintessential behavior plan that no one is going to be able to implement. And they should make problem behavior irrelevant, inefficient, and ineffective. In terms of the demographic summary, we need to include a brief summary of the student, 2 to 4 sentences, age, functioning level, relevant diagnoses, any kind of current medications that they're on, what the presenting problem is, any medical considerations. And we've talked about issues with operational definition. I won't reiterate that here, but we know what good definitions look like, and this will be covered in additional courses that you have as well. The functions of the behavior. We want to document the methods that were used to determine that function. And remember, we're going to place a high value on direct observation kinds of measures as part of that. Now, I think about a behavior plan as having 3 essential components from a treatment perspective. One is antecedent-based strategies, one is replacement skill training, and one is consequence-based strategies. And so we're going to talk about all 3 of those. From an antecedent-based strategies perspective, it's all about prevention. We're going to try to prevent this individual from engaging in these challenging behaviors. And it means that we have to avoid triggers using environmental adaptations, instructional adaptations, and curricular adaptations. From a consequence-based perspective, we're going to be talking not about prevention, but about what to do when prevention fails. What to do when, even though we've arranged the environment and we've done a number of things to try to make it less likely that the individual is going to engage in this behavior, the behavior still occurs. Staff need something that they can do in that context. Hang on, I had to turn the lights back on, and I could do that by moving in the classroom. So consequence-based strategies are procedures that are used following the occurrence of the behavior. There are ways that we increase appropriate behavior. There are ways we reduce inappropriate behavior. And we can increase appropriate behavior with reinforcement. Those of you who are in the ABA course have learned about positive and negative reinforcement. But whatever mechanism we use to increase behavior, it's about what strategies we're putting in place to reinforce appropriate behavior, to increase what we want to see the individual do. And then there are lots of different things we can do to decrease inappropriate behavior. And again, this is material that's covered in other coursework, but we use procedures like extinction, where we stop delivering the maintaining consequences that have been responsible for the maintenance of the behavior. Or we differentially reinforce. So we reinforce the absence of the behavior, or we reinforce an alternate behavior, or we reinforce an incompatible behavior, or we reinforce a low rate of the target behavior to slowly shape it down in frequency. And beyond those non-punishment procedures that we use to reduce behavior, we also can reduce behavior with punishment procedures. Overcorrection, timeout, response cost. Those kinds of interventions are least preferred. We try to change behavior without the use of punishment, but there are appropriate uses of punishment as part of comprehensive treatment packages, and those are some strategies that commonly are well matched to the functions of behavior and might be appropriate in educational settings. But remember, I said there were 3 prongs: antecedent-based strategies, what we're going to do to try to prevent the behavior; consequence-based strategies, what we're going to do to reinforce the absence of the behavior or adaptive behavior, and what we're going to do to consequate the inappropriate behavior. And then the third prong is replacement skills. This is a competing behavior model. What should they be doing instead? They have a motivation, a function that is not going to change. They are going to be escape motivated when it comes to math. They're going to be attention seeking in general because that's a highly valued reinforcer to them. What do we want them to do instead of throwing chairs, hitting people, screaming, falling on the floor? How do they express that particular need? And this is really about replacement skills. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, and this is covered in the ABA coursework, but there are huge drawbacks to the use of punishment. As I mentioned, that's going to be lowest on our list, and we're going to try to exhaust the positive-based procedures first. The main problems with punishment are summarized here. One is that it can evoke aggressive or emotional behavior. Think about yourselves. When someone is mean to you, you kind of get your back up, right? So we can see whenever we introduce punishing consequences that we can get emotional behavior, we can get upset, we can get aggression. So we have to track those kinds of behaviors. Anytime punishment is in the mix, we have to track those. This is my number one reason why I think we need to be reluctant about punishment, and it is that it's negatively reinforcing to the person who delivers it, and it makes it more likely that they use it in the future. Making sure that punishment is in the best interests of the learner is essential, and we should always use the least restrictive alternative. This is one of the problems with parenting. Why do parents scream at their kids? Because when they do, the child stops whining. When they do, the child stops doing the thing that was annoying them. It's negatively reinforcing to us as the punishers, and you know about negative reinforcement. That makes it much more likely for us to engage in similar kinds of behavior in the future, and that's a tremendous danger. They might also associate the person and the environment with aversive stimuli. I get punished there. I don't like that person. I don't like that classroom. I don't like that school. We might see avoidance behavior set in as a result of using punishing consequences. And maybe most importantly, from a behavior analytic perspective, we're all about building skills. Punishment does nothing to establish new skills in someone's repertoire. So we approach punishment with a lot of reluctance. So putting all of that together, we're going to assemble the team. We're going to review the competing behavior model. What should they be doing instead? What should they be doing instead? What are we going to build as we try to bring down behavior? Those of you who've taken the ABA course have learned about the fair pair rule. For every target of behavior we have to decrease, we have to have at least one to increase. And so we want to be thinking about what's the competing behavior and how are we going to build it. We want to look broadly at all of the information that's come in from an assessment perspective. What about setting events? What's going on with sleep? What's going on with eating? What's going on with other environmental variables? We want to look at immediate antecedents. We want to look at the consequences that are currently being administered. All of that was part of our hypothesis generation and our assessment and identification of function, and we want to look at alternatives. So we want to also talk about data. We are behavior analysts. When we develop a behavior intervention plan, we're going to make database decisions about whether that plan is having an impact. There are lots of different ways that we could collect those data, and they all have their uses. And this is, again, information that's covered in more detail in other courses, but quickly, some of the ways we would do that is rate. How many times in a certain period of time? 5 per hour, 6 per day, etc. It's basically frequency, but within the context of time. Or we could do a pure frequency count, where we're just tallying how many are occurring. Duration, how long the behavior lasts. When do we select that? Well, we select that when duration is a really important dimension of the behavior. Something like tantrums, for example. It may be more important not that they're engaging in it 3 times a day versus 5 times a day, but that the duration has gone down to an average of 6 minutes versus 42 minutes. That's a very important application of when duration might be the more significant dimension to track. Latency, how much time until the onset of a behavior. So how long after we say time to line up do we see them have a problem? How long after their entrance into circle time until they start to fidget? So that might be an important dimension too in terms of assessing tolerance or assessing self-control kinds of issues. And finally, we might look at sampling procedures. So we don't always record every instance of a behavior. We don't always look at every event in terms of looking at frequency or duration or latency. Sometimes we capture a sample of those behaviors, and we can do that in a number of different ways. So we could, for example, look at interval data in which we are, say, in the context of 15-minute intervals throughout the school day. At the end of the interval, we ask ourselves a question. Did the behavior occur or did it not occur? In whole interval, we're going to ask ourselves the question, did this behavior occur for the entire duration of the interval? All 10 seconds of a 10-second interval, all 15 minutes of a 15-minute interval. That's whole interval. We generally do that for appropriate behavior. Were they in their seat? Were they paying attention to the teacher? Those would be things we might take whole interval data on. For behavioral targets that we're trying to reduce, we're more likely to take partial interval data. Partial interval data would be, did it happen at all? So humming. Maybe a child hums off task in class. So at the end of the 15-minute interval, what the teacher asks herself is, did he hum at all since the last time I recorded data? Huge advantages to this over event recording like rate or duration. When a teacher's attention is split between many different individuals, when classroom resources are few, it's extremely difficult to do continuous recording. And it's much more helpful to do interval recording. And so a teacher could more confidently answer, did it happen at all, versus it happened 4 times versus 5 times versus 6 times. And you and I would be more likely to agree on occurrence versus non-occurrence than we would on 4 instances versus 5 instances. So all of those elements are part of the decision-making tree. Also, if you have a behavior that doesn't have a clear start and finish, humming, I don't know, like to see how many seconds does he have to be quiet between instances of humming for us to count it as instance number 2 versus instance number 1. So those are all factors that determine where we go in terms of data collection. And a final sampling procedure is something called momentary time sampling, which is at the end of that 15-minute interval, the teacher looks up and looks at Johnny and says, yes, now he's humming. Or no, now he's not humming. It doesn't matter what he did for 14 minutes and 59 seconds of that interval. It only matters what he was doing at the moment that I was checking him, that momentary sample. People like that even better sometimes than the partial interval because it is it's less attention. I don't even have to attend to what he was doing the whole time. I only have to look at him that particular instant. On the other hand, sometimes teachers don't like momentary time sampling because they'll say, oh, but he was doing it right before that and I got to mark down a no. So sometimes people have reactions to various procedures, but really it's about what realistically, what kind of data can be realistically taken in that particular setting. Terminal goals of the intervention. What are you aiming for? Is it 0? Is it an 80% reduction over 3 months? What are the behaviors and what does the criteria need to be? If it's aggression toward peers, we need to get down to 0 levels. If it's stereotypy, we need to bring it down so it is not interfering with work. So that's going to determine the kind of goal that we develop for the behavior. And this is one that is almost always forgotten. Procedures to fade the intervention. We put a behavior plan in place, we leave it in place. We forget about it. That's not good behavior analysis. All plans are designed to be faded, at least in part. But we need to operationally define what would that be. Ultimately, we want the natural contingencies of reinforcement that exist in that setting to control behavior. And we want our interventions to be not stigmatizing and to be normalized and natural. So we want to fade out the aspects of the intervention that are truly unusual or not part of what we would typically do for learners in that setting. Here's an example of a behavior intervention plan for a 6-year-old with autism and moderate mental retardation who's being referred for severe aggression. He uses PECS to communicate. Target behavior is aggression. Notice how it's defined. Striking another person with an open or closed fist from a distance of greater than 6 inches. Biting, contact between his teeth and the skin or clothing of another individual. So again, it includes clothing, not just skin. And you see the baseline rates are provided there. And the assessment procedures included all of the levels that we've talked about, the indirect or informant methods, the descriptive assessment, and a brief functional analysis. And it says it's escape from demands. The descriptive assessment, it gives 89% of the instances were preceded by the presentation of task materials. That's pretty confidence boosting. And 78% of the time, their aggression resulted in brief escape. And the brief functional analysis confirmed that. Antecedent strategies. And here's where the art of our science comes in. So we need to figure out how to enrich the environment to make this behavior less likely to occur. Prevention. What can we do to create an environment for this learner where they're less likely to engage in it? Well, we know he's escape motivated. One thing we can do at an antecedent level is provide frequent breaks to the individual non-contingently. Every 5 minutes, he gets 30 seconds off. We can also allow him to choose between 2 tasks. Escape-motivated learners respond very well to choice procedures. They can have a bit more control over that. We can make sure that the tasks we're presenting are at an appropriate instructional level. Maybe we have remediation problems. Maybe what we're asking him to do is truly outside his skill set and repertoire. And we can integrate mastered tasks with novel or difficult tasks. From a consequence-based strategy, the number one thing we're going to do here is in the replacement skill domain, remember that thread? Functional communication training to be trained to use a break card to request escape from demands. And you can see that it goes through a fading procedure too. So this is good behavior analysis because we're integrating various aspects of fading out things until the individual's behavior is more stable. Data collection is going to be rate, number of aggressive acts per day divided by the number of hours present, and appropriate requests for break. Wonderful. Remember fair pair rule. Trying to bring something down, trying to bring something up. So we're integrating that replacement skill focus. Terminal goals. For hitting, the target is to get down to 2.4, and for biting to 0.4. And the fading procedure, they have a couple of things. Delay to break is gradually increased, as you saw in that previous slide. He has to go more seconds waiting for it to be granted. And integrating the break card into PECS so that it eventually becomes something that is part of his general communication system. 4 rules of thumb when you're writing a behavior plan. Talk about how we're going to change. Not just about how the individual is going to change. How is staff, family, support staff going to change? What are we going to do differently? Make sure it's technically sound. Make sure you are thinking about function when you design your intervention. The reason we do the functional assessment is to develop function-based treatments. It has to fit well with the resources in that setting, or we have to advocate for increased resources. And it's got to be based on the function of behavior. About how we'll change. It includes changes to the curriculum, changes we make to the physical setting, changes to the person's schedule. It's not just about how the behavior of the individual is going to change, and it should be written like an instruction manual so that people can come in and understand what to do. When we say it should be technically sound, we mean it should be consistent with basic behavioral principles. We want to make the inappropriate behavior irrelevant, inefficient, and ineffective. We don't want the challenging behavior to work anymore. Instead, we want to create an environment in which what works for the individual is appropriate pro-social replacement skills and requests in appropriate ways for what they need, not the challenging aberrant behaviors. The goal that we have is not to design the perfect plan, but to design the most effective plan that's possible to implement in that setting. We want it to fit into the routine of that setting. If we can't achieve that, then we need to be having a different conversation about what kind of setting could do it or what kind of resources need to be allocated. But all of those systems issues are part of what we think about as a behavior analyst in terms of effectiveness. The behavior plan should include summary statements from your assessment, and if those provide the basis for our plan, all of our interventions need to be directly linked to the functions that have been identified. This is a chart I really like that has antecedent-based strategies, consequence-based strategies, and contraindicated strategies for different functions of behavior. I hope you like it as much as I do. For things that are maintained by attention, we can provide non-contingent attention. We can go to that learner every 5 minutes and give them a thumbs up or a pat on the back or an indication that the teacher's noticing them being on task. And we can increase opportunities for appropriate social interaction. From a consequence perspective, we can do a replacement skill, reinforce appropriate demands for attention. So we teach them to ask, play with me, or hey, look at me, or watch this. We can also use extinction. We no longer attend to the inappropriate behaviors. And we might consider timeout because attention-motivated behaviors are well suited to timeout as a punishment strategy if we need to layer that in. What we would not do, reprimands. Contraindicated. Remember, it could be negative attention that maintains behaviors too. For things maintained to access to tangibles, we could give non-contingent access to preferred items, and we could do manned training so they can ask for what they want at an antecedent level. From a consequence level, we're going to reinforce the FCT responses. Anytime they appropriately man, they get it. Extinction when they do it inappropriately. Possibly response cost. You don't have access to that if you engage in inappropriate behaviors. That could be an appropriate function-linked use of a punishment strategy that has utility in that kind of context. And the one thing we'd want to caution staff not to do is to give access to tangibles contingent on problem behavior. So when they fall on the floor in the hallway, you don't come over and say, oh, you wanted your koosh ball? Here it is. Right? We want to make sure that that's provided contingent on appropriate behavior. Escape from demands. We talked about this one a lot, so quickly. Provide frequent breaks. Integrate mastered tasks with novel tasks so that it's not doing hard things over and over again, but we mix in more difficult demands with easier demands. And remediation for serious deficits. We also want to reinforce demands for escape that are appropriate and possibly do escape extinction so that they can't get out of demands by engaging in inappropriate behavior. We must work through that. And contraindicated would be timeout. You know, you send an escape-motivated child to the principal's office, it's celebration, right? It's not appropriate for escape-motivated behavior. Automatic reinforcement, this is the hardest and one that we have to think the most about, but we might provide non-contingent access for certain periods of the day, or we might introduce items that compete with the behavior. So somebody who really likes rocking and flicking, we might find appropriate ways for them to do that. We could use differential reinforcement procedures to either reinforce the alternate behavior that we're replacing it with or just a lower level or absence of the behavior. And we might do some blocking to prevent them from getting that sensory access. The main thing to remember about matching treatment to function in this context of automatic reinforcement is don't think that there's nothing you can do just because it's automatically reinforced or that medication is the only viable treatment. There's so much we can do as behavior analysts, even for automatically reinforcing behaviors. Often there are secondary functions, and even when it's automatic, there's much we can do at an antecedent level, at a consequence level, and at a replacement skill level. And those are the three threads that you've got to carry across any behavior plan for any function that we identify. So that's it for function-based treatment. Again, I haven't even done assignments on this for you. I wanted you to be exposed to it from an assessment perspective. It's not part and parcel of this course per se. It's going to be covered in much greater detail in other courses for those of you that are taking the ABA sequence, for example. But I did want you to have a sense of it because it's such an important part of the way we conceptualize and understand assessment for individuals with autism. I hope that gave you a sense of some of the most common themes in assessment and in function-based treatment, and broadened your view of how we might approach those particular issues in our learners. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you real soon.